Good morning, Washington. My name is Christina. I work with the AARP Washington State Office. Thank you so much for joining us today. You know, uh, September is National Preparedness Month, and here in Washington, the stakes are rising. Wildfires, storms, other natural disasters are becoming more frequent, yet many of us aren't as ready as we should be. And that is why we are here today. We're going to be joined by some really special guests to share some expert information. And while we do have a lot of information to share with you today, we're setting aside some time at the end to try and take some of your questions. So if you have questions that you would like to ask of our experts, if you can look kind of at the bottom of your computer screen, there are a couple of little quotation bubbles. And if you hover over that, it will say chat. If you open that chat box, you can go ahead and enter any of your questions that you would like us to go ahead and field today. And we'll also be sharing some resources as we go along and some additional stuff. So, as I said, there's a lot of natural disasters. They're becoming more frequent. And the reality is that we're just not as prepared as we should be. In fact, a survey of older adults that AARP did said that while 59% of older adults expressed confidence in their ability to navigate a natural disaster emergency, a majority of them have not taken steps to get ready. It's not your fault. I've been in a natural disaster myself, and I am not as prepared as I should be as well. In that same survey, less than 1/3 said that they had created a comprehensive plan for natural disasters. And the reality is that, unfortunately, older adults are often the hardest hit when a disaster strikes. And with a growing older adult population, preparing now is more important than ever. And we know that planning for the unexpected can be really, really daunting, which is why I am joined, as you can see with the screen, with a whole plethora of experts today that are going to talk through some of the steps that you can take in order to plan for your circumstances and your family. Tessa, why don't you toss up the slides? I'll walk through some things, and then we're going to hand it off to Serena to start the day off. There we go. So again, it's September is National Preparedness Month, and while we've got this locked in for September, natural disasters happen year round, and so there really is not a bad time to start planning for natural disasters. So today is as good as any to get started. Next slide. AARP does have our own disaster resilience toolkit. And while this is really geared specifically for like municipalities, organizations, aging professionals, there is a lot of information in there that is also applicable just for you. We will be sharing some of these resources later and also in a follow-up email. Go on the next one, Tessa. And we're not going to be done today. This is a big topic. And so we are hosting another session, same day, same time next week, where we're going to tackle some additional topics on really kind of prepping your house. We're going to have someone on to talk about some of the common disasters in the state of Washington and what our emergency management group in Washington does in order to protect us. But right now, we are going to kick off today with a special guest, Serena Segura. Serena is an emergency preparedness coordinator for the Residential Care Services Division at the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services. Serena is an expert. She's been doing this for 20 years, emergency management in state service, including leadership roles at the Department of Health and the Emergency Management Division. And Serena also played a key role in Washington's COVID-19 response And where she sits right now, she supports long term care providers in preparing for and responding to emergencies. And we're excited to have her share her insights in today for an aspect of disaster planning that maybe families don't necessarily take into account. It's not just about what's going on in your home, but also what happens with your loved ones who might be out in a residential facility. So, Serena, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to you for the next section.
Thank you, Christina. So I am here from Residential Care Services at Department of Social and Health Services, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we do and why we do what we do. And then I'll tell you a little bit about how I've been involved in my own personal preparedness for my granny. So for long-term care in Washington State, Residential Care Services licenses, regulates, and oversees the quality of care in over 4,700 licensed or certified residential long-term care settings. These settings include adult family homes, which are smaller, usually 6 to 8 beds, assisted living facilities, enhanced service facilities, intermediate care facilities for individuals with intellectual disabilities, nursing facilities, and supported living. Approximately 79,000 vulnerable adults receive care and services in these settings, and that number continues to grow every day. Our population of aging adults continues to increase, so we continue to expand our services. Next slide, please. So a little bit of what we do. We provide publications that provide information to our providers about seasonal hazards, change in guidance, best practices, those types of things. We also collaborate and partner with many organizations at the federal, state, and local levels, from CDC at the federal level to Department of Health at the state level, the state fire marshal's office, and the local health jurisdictions, both for public health and for emergency management. It takes a community to make sure that we focus on the whole community, which our aging and long-term population is part of. So with that, we work to provide updates to the community. We work to provide training and exercise opportunities to practice their plans and provide best practices for what their plans should be. Next slide, please. So for the providers, we do monitor situations that are happening. So right now it's wildfires are our biggest focus. We will evaluate the impacts to long-term care facilities. We watch to see if any of them are in or approaching evacuation zones. And we work to contact those impacted facilities to make sure that they are following their plans, that they have plans that are adequate. We have found that at sometimes the facilities look to their sister facilities and they're only down the road, and that facility is also in an evacuation zone. So making sure that they are getting completely out of harm's way. We'll work with our local partners to make sure that they have the resources they need, such as transportation, and they can move their population as necessary. We provide guidance that's sent out for best practices, changes in guidance from Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, from our state changes in laws and regulations. And we also include topics such as power outages, wildfire, flooding, heat, 911 outages, smoke, winter weather preparedness, and others. Power outages is one thing that has changed over the last couple of years, where Washington State has looked to California to follow their best practices, where if there's a wildfire with certain criteria in weather pattern behaviors and fire pattern behaviors, that they turn off the power as a public safety power shutoff, which is a planned event. So that is a new type of power outage that we are seeing here in Washington State, and we've been providing information and guidance to the providers on that as well. We do provide training and exercise information, around different types of scenarios that we have in Washington state, from earthquakes to tsunamis and flooding and winter weather. But we do have some limitations. There is no mass communication system between the state and long-term care facilities. That is something that we continue to work on to remedy. There is no monitoring that's 24/7. I am the only person on the team working on emergency management with this focus, but we do our best as a team at DSHS. And facilities may not always keep RCS informed, as we are the regulator and not first responders. So they may look to other community partners that are local that would be their first line of defense for first responders, but we are part of the process. Next slide, please. So facilities do have regulatory requirements to report impacts from emergencies and events. This doesn't mean that they have to report right as that emergency is happening. So if they are evacuating because of a fire in their facility, their first call is not to us. It should absolutely be to 911 and to their community partners to make sure that their residents are accounted for and safe. That is number one priority. So we might not learn for hours later. We're not first responders, but we do investigate every complaint that's received. So this could just be a report that something happened, and we do prioritize complaints that pose immediate risk to health and safety of our residents. So that is first line of defense for us. We do coordinate with our partners from the State Fire Marshal's Office, Department of Health, especially their construction review unit. We also work with the Northwest Regional Healthcare Response Network, who does provide a lot of the first response to emergencies for them. We do coordinate for surge of intakes, and we address life safety issues, especially when there's fire watches in place from wildfires. Next slide, please. So for our laws and regulations, assisted living is regulated by our WACs in Washington state. They are not regulated by CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That is the federal entity. They do, however, oversee nursing homes. So in Washington, the assisted living facilities follow the WACs, and they do not have the same requirements as nursing homes. Nursing homes currently have more regulations on them for emergency preparedness planning. One of the things that we have recognized is in their disaster relocation plans, sometimes there is conflict between where the facility has planned to go for an evacuation. So if it is an incident within the facility that has no other emergencies around it, such as they're evacuating from a fire in their facility and they move their residents to a sister facility down the road, there's usually no conflict there. The conflict happens when there is a larger area, such as a wildfire, creating an evacuation zone, and they have planned to go to their sister facility, but that facility also needs to move, or that facility is outside and multiple facilities are trying to move their residents there, and it causes an overflow. So we work with them to make sure that we are finding solutions and resources for them during those incidents. Next slide, please. So CMS has some very structured outline for emergency preparedness and the rules around that. They make sure that they are having their plans annually reviewed, that they're updated, that they have identified their risks for that area. So right now we know wildfires has changed from an Eastern Washington risk to a statewide risk. They know that flooding can happen more across the state, not just in Western Washington, right? So we've got these different scenarios that we can build our planning off of, and they continue to change as time goes on. Western Washington used to not have so much of a heat issue. And now we're seeing some extreme heat where that was typically an Eastern Washington problem. So these different issues can be addressed in their emergency planning. Um, these also rely on state regulations. So, what our laws and regulations are saying for our emergency planning, they also support that. Next slide, please. So, with that, Substitute House Bill 1218 was passed in 2021. And the focus is on improving the health and safety and quality of life for residents and long term care facilities by creating stricter standards for emergency preparedness, communication, access, and support for residents' rights. We are in the process of drafting the rules around emergency preparedness and our infection protection and control portions of this bill that has passed. So it is really to start looking at the disasters and emergencies that include fire and earthquake, floods, infectious disease outbreaks, loss of power or water, and other events that may require sheltering in place, evacuation, or other emergency measures to protect the health and safety of residents. This bill came about because of COVID-19. It was recognizing during COVID-19, during the 2021 legislative cycle, that they were disproportionately impacting long-term care facilities. So we had more facilities that were impacted, more deaths in long-term care facilities than anywhere else. It was over 50%. So this bill came about to help strengthen some of that for long-term care across the state, not dependent on what facility type. All facility types are included in this bill at this point. So we will continue to work on this and strengthen our emergency preparedness focus for long-term care facilities through this bill. They will be inspected and graded against new criteria for emergency preparedness in the future. So that is being strengthened in our state. Next slide, please. So this is my granny. My granny lived in an assisted living facility for 12 years, and that's a long time. She had Alzheimer's, and English was not her first language. Japanese was, and I don't speak hardly any Japanese at all. And she did not require nursing care, but she did require daily care. And in the last several years of her life, she was more or less wheelchair bound. She could still walk on occasion, but not always. She did not recognize who I was. Probably the last 8 years she was in, and she actually gave me a different role in her life. I became her nei-chan, which in Japanese is big sister, even though I'm her granddaughter. So we built that relationship on family and trust, and I visited her usually 2 or 3 times a week to make sure that she had the things that she needed. In the facility, they provided American food and did not cater to a Japanese palate. So I made sure I always brought her Japanese food that she liked, and it usually made her a more compliant resident in there and a little happier. So we made sure to take care of her. And her favorite thing was to always have strawberry ice cream at the end of her meal. So I always made sure I had those little tiny Haagen-Dazs strawberry ice creams in our freezer to take to her. So she was part of our emergency plan. My husband and I had decided early on that she would be part of our emergency plan. And if something happened in the facility and she could not stay there, she would be welcomed into our home. We had those discussions with the facility that we could provide temporary care for her in an event that the facility could not. What that also meant was we needed to be prepared for what she needed. Next slide, please. So that meant Granny needed a thickener for her water. She could no longer drink water without choking and having issues with that. So we made sure that things that she needed were always stocked at our home that she was included in our planning, in our resources, and had what she needed. So that could be clothing. We had clothing and shoes always available for her, her medication, all of her prescriptions, all of her documents were part of our emergency plan, put in one place. So everything was together, phone numbers we had for all of that. So if this is something that you can provide for your loved ones who may be in long-term care facilities, this is one way to do it. Personal preparedness is personal, right? So we need to do what is right for what we can do and expect to do. If she was needing nursing care, I know I can't provide that. I'm not a nursing professional. But because she didn't need that, there were things we could prepare for. And perhaps it is in your emergency plan that you're just providing resources for your loved ones that might help during a disaster. Maybe they need some extra clothes. Maybe they need their medical records. Maybe they need their birth certificate, right? These are things that we can have in our kits that are ready so we can support those that we love, right? And make sure that we're all accounted for. It takes a whole community to make sure that we're all right and we're all together. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much for Serena. I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that, when we're planning for an emergency, it's not only just about what's happening in our house. If we have loved ones that are living out in the community that are relying on us, we need to make sure they're prepared as well. So I really appreciate that information. Just as a reminder, if you have questions that you would like us to fill towards the end of this presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat box. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our team from SBP. SBP is a disaster resilience and recovery nonprofit who has worked with AARP across the nation in order to help our members make sure that they're planned and ready for national disasters. So I'm going to be tossing it off to Tessa and Helen. Tessa is the Prepare Program Associate at SBP. Before that, she served at the state of South Carolina in disaster recovery and mitigation, where she coordinated dozens of resilience-focused projects. Tessa also brings experience from her work with the Deputy City Manager for Resilience and Sustainability in Annapolis, Maryland. Hi, Tessa. And then we are also joined by Helen Wiley, also with SBP. Helen is the Disaster Preparedness Program Director at SBP and a founding board member of Insurance for Good. She brings deep expertise in disaster insurance and risk communication, with experience leading public policy initiatives at the Wharton Risk Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Helen has also contributed to international climate and disaster reduction efforts through her work with the German Development Institute and the UN Institute for Environment and Human Security. Tessa and Helen, go ahead and turn it over to you for the next portion.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you, Serena, for starting us off with a really wonderful first segment. My name is Tessa Baran, and I am with SBP, and we'll start here by just giving a little bit of a background of who we are as a nonprofit national organization. So like Christina said, we are an organization that focuses on disaster recovery and resilience. We got our start 2 decades ago in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And in those early days, we really focused our main mission on, getting folks back home and getting folks back into safe, sanitary, and secure housing conditions. In the 2 decades since our organization got its start, we realized that in order to really achieve what we're trying to do across the board at our organization of shrinking the time between disasters and recovery, well, again, in order to do that, we realized we have to get more proactive. We have to get ahead of the storm. And so, or any disaster type. And so what you could see here is, we've bucketed out our main program areas at SBP. And what we've really tried to do across the organization is direct our programming to the full disaster cycle, the full disaster spectrum. And so we are seated in the disaster preparedness program. And so we'll share more about that program in a slide or two here. But again, we've really tried to focus our efforts across the cycle. So what we can do is ultimately empower communities throughout the nation to build more resilience to future disasters, with the ultimate goal of keeping ourselves safe and our families and our communities and our properties, et cetera. So I'm just going to share a little bit more about our disaster preparedness program, and then we'll get into some key actions that we're really going to recommend that folks take to better prepare yourselves and your families amidst this world of increasing disasters that we're seeing. In our preparedness program, we know that unfortunately there will be another disaster. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so what that means is that we need to understand how to best get ourselves prepared. We try in our preparedness program, a lot to work with different audience sets to provide different resources, tools, and education to help folks make more informed disaster preparedness decisions so we can ultimately empower individuals and communities to build towards becoming more resilient. We have, and it'll be dropped in the chat if it hasn't been already, a link to our resource hub that are across the organization. We have different preparedness and recovery resources, like two of the example guides that we have on the slide here, but we have a plethora of other guides, videos, short form videos. We have a link to additional trainings that we have free available to the public. And so we have a large suite of resources that we really hope that folks will take advantage of after we wrap up today, knowing that this is going to be a starting point and we're going to introduce a lot of topics. We'll cover a lot of content areas of different preparedness actions that we want folks to take. But again, there's so much more that we want to encourage folks to do. And we hope that our guides are a good help there. To offer a little overview of what we're going to look at in this next session during this webinar today, we'll first start talking about protecting important documents. What are those documents that we want folks to be organizing and safeguarding? What are different strategies to doing that? We'll spend a lot of time talking about financial preparedness, and we'll look at different funding mechanisms that may be available post-disaster, understanding that a huge part of getting prepared for disasters is knowing how you're going to recover if you're impacted. We'll do a deep dive then into insurance, and then we'll wrap up content areas with looking at contractor fraud and really giving you information that you need to help spot contractor fraud so you can avoid it. And then we'll round out our session looking at a variety of different resources. With that, I will pass it to Helen to get into topic area 1.
Thanks, Tessa. And just a reminder, as we see different questions coming in on the chat about emergency preparations, this is a 2-part series. And so some of the topics we're not going to be able to get to today, but we'll be covering in the next session. And so with that, what we're covering on the SBP end today is some really key areas that when we unfortunately look at recovery and challenges of households and individuals across the U.S., these are some big gap areas that folks don't think about, but that we can do a lot more pre-disaster on. And so I'm going to start with better protecting important documents. Next slide, please. And so with that, there's a lot of different types of documents that are important to think about in your home just generally. So where you're storing your personal IDs, birth and marriage certificates, if you have immigration papers, if you have microchip information on any pets you have, that general household information. So who are your emergency contacts, any service providers you have. So for utilities, and any type of services that come into your home. What are those keepsake items? And so when we're thinking about these 4 categories, we're going to go into how to protect them and where they're most relevant when we're thinking about disaster recovery. But ideally, pre-disaster, what you would be doing is starting to identify the documents that are most important for you to go about better protecting your home. And they're going to cross these different categories. And so if you're making a preparedness plan, having that list of your emergency contacts written down somewhere very accessible, ideally putting it in your emergency kit, having it very quick, if you are evacuating off-site, that you're able to bring it with you. But unfortunately, what we see in particular is in the financial and legal space is that one area that where people really have delays in their recovery after disasters is by not having that important insurance policy information on hand or ownership papers, so titles for your home or cars, things that could be damaged during a disaster event. And so this is a really important category area to think about gathering documents up, making copies of them, saving them online as well in secure manners so that you can really speed up that process of either putting in insurance claims after a disaster or applying for disaster assistance through the federal government if it's available. And then the fourth category here being medical. So again, if you use MyChart or another online service through your doctor offices, you might have a lot of your medical information already online. That being said, if you don't know your passwords or you're not really on those online portals, it's really helpful to have critical information written down about what are your key prescriptions, who are your doctors, and have that information readily accessible so that if you're evacuating away from your home and need to also pick up, new versions of your prescriptions from not your normal pharmacy, but a different location, it's easier to start going through that process of contacting your doctor's offices and getting prescriptions reissued. So we're going to go more in here, but just want folks to think about these four different categories, and we'll be sending out some key document resource lists that have a lot more detail on, really more specifically these different document areas to be thinking about organizing pre-disaster. Next slide, please. And so importantly, you have to think about for you or for loved ones or those that you're caring for of what is the best storage method in trying to make these types of important documents more accessible post-disaster and avoid having them be destroyed and needing to, particularly if they're, again, like a copy of your driver's license or birth certificate, needing to apply and go through a lengthy process to get copies of them. And so for those that are comfortable using digital methods, it's really great to scan documents using your phone or a scanner. This could include going to your public library and using a scanner there. You can then save documents either to flash drives that are labeled as being, important documents that you can put in maybe your emergency kit or what would be your evacuation to go bag. If you have a cloud storage service that you're comfortable using, such as Google Drive, iCloud, or Dropbox, that can also be a place where you would be putting copies of this information. Always important, of course, with cybersecurity concerns, though, to weigh different risks around, how to best password protect digital versions of your important documents if they're going online. And so ideally, we want to have 2 digital copies in different locations if you are going online, just in case, again, you lose accessibility. Next slide, please. And so another great complement, so you could do one or both methods or just do physical document storage, but is thinking through, again, how do you make sure? So if you're in an area that has higher risks of flood, you might want to think more about waterproof folders as an option of how to best secure all of your important documents. If you have concerns about both water damage as well as fire, doing a fire and waterproof safe container might be the best option for you to secure all those documents safely in your home. Ideally, again, locating this information in a place that you can easily take it out of your home if you're planning to evacuate pre-disaster rather than needing to leave it behind. I will say again, if you, as a starting point, if costs are a factor with buying something like a larger fireproof container, it's still a great place to start of just getting a simple waterproof folder or using Ziploc bags, since they have some level of waterproofness to help you as you're getting going with this process. And then the other thing to think about is, who is that person? So if, for instance, you can't get your important documents out during a disaster event, because you need to very quickly get out, Is there a key family member or friend who you could give copies of your important documents to store it somewhere else so that, again, you can quickly obtain those documents from them if something were to occur and know that they're safely secured elsewhere? Next slide, please. So a few more things here. Again, this is just a great tip area of where to get going in preparedness because it doesn't cost anything. It just takes time. And again, can really save you some headaches post-disaster by having organized everything. And so if you need help getting going, go to your public library to work on scanning documents, seeing if office supply stores can help you. Ask a trusted family member or friend to help with scanning and uploading or making copies. See if your local senior center or community center can help you with any tech support on getting your documents gathered. And then importantly, if you go through any big life changes like moving or changing doctors, try to revisit once a year. So put it on your calendar for January each year that you're going to review your documents and see if there's any major updates to make so that your information is going to be really helpful, again, if something were to unfortunately occur. Next slide, please. And then last thing here, if you are working with older adults, although again, I'd say these things are helpful for anyone facing a disaster, unfortunately, but you can go through and use a document checklist to help someone easily identify and organize their essential documents. So again, we'll share resources for doing that after the presentation today. Offering assistance to someone with storing their documents, making it feel less overwhelming to them by helping them start to go through this process of organizing the documents. If someone's not familiar with a lot of the tech platforms available today that are password protected, helping them to upload the scanned versions into Google Drive, for instance. And then just being there to have annual conversations. So if you're a family member or if you're a caregiver in various forms, helping to ensure that you're talking about this among other different types of preparedness actions like evacuation and sheltering and making sure someone feels very secure in their plan for all these things. Next slide, please. So with that, Tessa's going to keep us going.
All right. Thanks, Helen. We'll now really shift gears and talk about financial preparedness. How can we build financial resilience for future disasters? So we're going to break down the next few slides looking at some main category areas of financial resources that may be available to you after a disaster event. And so I really encourage, as we go through these different category areas, for you to start thinking through which one makes the most sense for me, for my family's needs. And so then once we wrap up today, if you can go through an exercise of really deep diving into each of these and starting to make your recovery plan, we hope this information will help you get well on your way. So first is savings. We understand in this financial climate environment, it's not always possible to set aside emergency cash that's going to be used directly in an emergency situation. With that being the case, we know that disasters are unpredictable. And so you might encounter things post-event that you really wish that you have emergency cash set aside for. So what that could look like is if you have to evacuate, you potentially could be looking at the cost of sheltering, maybe for 2 or 3 days, but you could also be dealing with longer term stays away from home. So having cash set aside directly for that is going to go a long way in your immediate recovery time. We'll spend some time talking about deductibles in the next insurance, the next slide here, but understanding now that when we're looking at this bucket of savings and different items that we really want to encourage you to save for related to disasters, that saving for deductibles is a huge one. We know that deductibles, that's the amount of money that you're going to be expected to pay out of pocket before you can expect to receive an insurance payout. We'll dive into this, but we at SBP, we are huge proponents of insurance as the best and most effective tool for disaster recovery. And with that being the case, we want to make sure that we're saving for deductibles so that way you can access that majorly important tool. Again, kind of covered this already, but we know that we can encounter unexpected expenses after a disaster. So this could be things like clearing debris, increased fuel cost of fuel for a generator. We talked about long-term stays away from your home if your home sustains pretty severe storm damage. So knowing that before a disaster, we cannot possibly know how a disaster will impact our home and our livelihood. So having a savings set aside, if financially possible for you and your family, again, it's going to go a long way. Loans and credit is another important one to understand. And again, this is just a high-level exploratory look at these different category areas. And we really encourage you, once we wrap up today, to continue learning. And we have a lot of great resources that'll help you prepare your finances for disasters. But for loans, just understanding, I want to call out here, the Small Business Administration post-disaster and federally declared disaster areas does offer disaster assistance loans in the form of low interest loans. And so this is something that a lot of folks may not be aware of. There's some confusion with the source being the Small Business Administration. So understanding that these low interest loans are available to households post-disaster can be a little bit confusing. And so it's really critical to understand before a disaster strikes, what are those different financial sources that may become available? And this is certainly something that we want households to be aware of if a loan is something that makes the most sense for you and your family's financial needs. Shifting gears here now, talking a little bit about federal disaster assistance. When folks often think of how they're going to recover from a disaster, what comes to mind oftentimes first is FEMA disaster assistance. And so we certainly want folks to take advantage of the federal resources that are available to them. But with that being the case, it's really critical to understand what are different limitations that are associated with this type of aid. And again, really important to understand if this is going to be a disaster tool that you're going to rely on. One, we know that a certain threshold has to be met in order for a federal disaster declaration to be declared. If that threshold is not met, what that means is that those federal recovery dollars will not be available. And so that would be very problematic for a family that had planned on solely relying on federal disaster aid, and if it's not available. We also know that in the event that disaster aid is available post-event, it can take time to reach a household. And so we really want to equip folks with the information they need to get started on their recovery process as quickly as possible post-event. So knowing that there are time limitations is critical. We also see, and I'll be pretty quick here so we can keep things moving, but we're happy to answer questions and point you to more resources. But there's this idea of if, for example, a household had received federal disaster aid for, let's say, a flood event in the past, there's now an insurance mandate on this household. This household has to maintain insurance for a like event. If that family moves and another family comes in, they may or not be aware of the fact that there is this insurance mandate. If they don't keep up with that insurance and they get impacted by another flood event and then go to apply for federal aid, they're going to run into problems there with not understanding that there is an insurance mandate, and that again they're going to have issues with accessing repeat aid. So it's a little bit convoluted there, but the key takeaway for this third bullet point here is that it's really critical for households to understand if there is an insurance mandate. So talk to previous homeowners, talk to your insurance agent, and understand what may or may not be a requirement for your household. Again, personal preparedness, we're talking a lot about financial preparedness here. It's critical because we don't know if we're going to be able to rely on disaster assistance, may not be available for folks. So kind of walking through some things that you can do if you're a family member and you have older adult individuals, if you're a caregiver, or if you are just wanting some extra support and not quite sure where to go to next. One of our top recommendations here is to set aside, again, savings. Work with older adults to set up a savings account where you can set up automated deposits of a certain amount each month or every couple of months. So this process, again, is automated and, again, automatically happens. And so folks don't have to think about it. It just is set up in such a way where it happens. Helping older adults go through the process of understanding if they will be eligible for federal aid, should it be available post-event, and helping older adult individuals apply for federal aid, apply for SBA loans, things of that nature. Helen spent a lot of time walking through important documents and things to protect. This is certainly something that you can assist older adult individuals with, whether it's digitizing these documents or just going through the process of organizing them. And then additionally, wanting to point you to area agencies on aging and other senior centers and resources in your community that may be able to provide resources in recovery. So we'll now spend some time kind of deep diving into insurance here.
Yeah, we're starting to wind down the webinar here, so we're going to move quickly, but also want to make sure to save time for questions and can stay on after the hour as needed. And so Tessa laid the foundation here of, unfortunately, things like disaster assistance are typically really one time only. And so while insurance is expensive, it is this best tool for recovery we have out there financially. And so want to lay some groundwork here of what's really important in the insurance space. So first off, there's both homeowners and renters insurance available. And a lot of renters don't actually get renters insurance coverage unless it's required by their landlord. And so if you're a renter, think about purchasing it. If you're in a wildfire prone area and your apartment were to be destroyed, then this would help you cover the cost of replacing your personal property. And so the difference between a homeowner and renter's policy is that homeowners policies are both contents and structure versus renter's insurance only covers personal property. Next slide, please. So another thing, though, that's really important that there's massive confusion on all across the US is that both homeowners and renters policies almost universally exclude coverage for flood. Flood insurance coverage is purchased separately, and so it's important to know that if you sustain flood damage to your home or your apartment, that those policies would not provide coverage for you to recover from that specific type of damage. The same would be true for earthquake. If you're in an earthquake-prone area, you would need an earthquake policy to give you coverage there. Next slide, please. And so I think we've hammered this home a lot, and it doesn't help with the fact that insurance is expensive. It is increasing in costs with the increasing risks around disaster events today. But we just see across disasters that those with the right insurance coverages recover better and faster than those without insurance. And one key statistic here is that the average FEMA disaster assistance grant award, so what Tessa was talking about, is on average only about $5,000 per recipient versus those that are able to use actually a federal flood insurance policy receive on average close to $70,000 in their payout. And so that just puts in, mind of this budgeting for ahead of time that you pay monthly premiums can really help amplify the dollars post-disaster that are available to you in your recovery. Next slide, please. And so with that, we don't have time to go do a deep dive on insurance today. We'll send out some additional resources on, making sure you're getting the right insurance coverage and talk with your insurance agent to make sure you understand what is currently in your policies. But a few key tips are, we were talking about having savings and cash pre-disaster. Ideally, if you have insurance, you're also going to save for deductibles because deductibles are that amount that you're responsible for paying out of pocket before you can have that larger payout from a typical insurance policy. And so if you haven't set aside the cash amount that would be required in that situation, you're not going to be able to get the payout until you're able to first pay the deductible. And so important to be thinking about that. Next slide, please. There we go. And so going back to the document storage issue, there's a lot of cross-cutting things here. And so something you can do, and this is really helpful not only for insurance claims, but also if you were applying for disaster assistance, is making a home inventory pre-disaster. So this could be by taking pictures of items all across your home, or literally walking with your phone through your home and filming, what is generally in each room, so that you have that documentation of not only the belongings in your home, but the state of it, that you can then have be part of what you submit to your insurance company or FEMA for assistance. And so just really encourage folks to do this. And then if you're storing things digitally with your documents, you add this in there as well. Next slide, please. And then if you do go through a disaster, which hopefully no one will, the Washington State Office of the Insurance Commissioner is a great resource for you. Every state insurance department has a division or subdepartment of consumer protection. And so if you're having trouble with, reaching a settlement with your insurance provider, that office within Washington State can really help you navigate some of those issues and provide different resources for you in that process. So that's one key thing to think about at the state level. If you do have a national flood insurance program policy, contacting your FEMA agent and rep to navigate challenges there is good. And then on the third resource can be really helpful post disaster is that United Policyholders is a national nonprofit that really works to help folks navigate all kinds of insurance issues and provides a lot of consumer protections. And so they have a lot of wonderful resources on their site, as well as hotlines that can help folks post disaster. Next slide, please. And so if you're helping someone, again, prep for disasters or recover, we'll just reiterate here, helping people to make their home inventory. So helping them film throughout their home if they have mobility challenges, and it would be more helpful for you or someone else to film in their home. Helping folks check eligibility for any discounts. Sometimes there's senior discounts for different types of insurance policies. We're not covering in detail mitigation today. We'll talk a lot more about protecting your home in the next session next week. But there's also ways to make insurance more cost effective by investing in different types of mitigation measures that can create savings for your insurance policies. Helping folks make sure that they understand their coverage details. So reviewing that fine print jointly and coming up with those questions that then you can help them bring to their insurance agent. And just like with important documents, marking on the calendar that annual time, maybe right when your insurance policy is going to be renewed, that you're going to review it and make sure you understand what is and isn't covered and if anything has changed. Next slide, please. And Tessa's going to wrap this up. And please keep putting questions in the chat.
Alrighty, thanks all. We'll continue on here as we start to wrap up to avoiding contractor fraud. Unfortunately, during disasters, they bring out the best and the worst in folks. And so we definitely want to spend a little bit of time giving you top tips to making sure that you are avoiding contractor fraud. So I want to start off with some major red flags and some warning signs. First, what you should, if you ever encounter any solicitations door to door, this is after an event of contractors, again, going door to door and offering services, this should automatically be a red flag. We know in disaster times, legitimate and reputable contractors are busy and they certainly don't have the time to go door to door trying to solicit work. And so if you encounter this, this is a red flag. If you are in a situation where a contractor is using any type of high pressure sales tactics or making any unrealistic promises, such as, they can come in and fix all of your storm damage. So you hopefully not, but say there's a scenario where you sustained a lot and this contractor is making these promises of me and my team can get in here this afternoon and have you fixed up and ready to go within 24 hours. That should be a warning sign. A contractor that refuses to provide their identification, their licenses, any references. These are things we're wanting to be aware of. And any contractors that are not wanting to sign a contract, putting anything in written format is a huge sign of concern and definitely something that we want to avoid. We want everything to be documented and we want a very strong paper trail throughout the recovery process. If possible, if there is a contractor that is demanding cash payments, that's a red flag. We certainly want to avoid paying in cash if that's possible. We oftentimes see contractors, if they do learn what your insurance settlement is, then that magically becomes the cost of their work. And so we definitely want to not share this information with any contractors to avoid that. And then if we encounter a contractor who is telling us, we are not going to get the proper permits or inspections because I know you want to get home and that'll just delay the process, that's a huge red flag. That's something we want to avoid. And so we'll see some overlap here with top tips. We just looked at warning signs, but top tips and ways to help avoid contractor fraud are one, getting multiple estimates from multiple different contractors to really get a good sense of what the work should cost. Helen just spent some time walking us through home inventory, and this comes into play and has importance across the disaster recovery process, including it can help us to document the property condition and our different belongings before work begins. So again, we have strong documentation there. A top tip, shared a little bit about this already, but we definitely want to make sure that we are spending time to really look into references, licenses, different types of credentials. So any time spent on the front end doing this is not time wasted. This is really going to help to ensure that you are connecting yourself with a reputable, trusted, and legitimate contractor. Again, having a very strong paper trail, having your contract written certainly is an important thing, but any communications, any requests, any changes in scope, anything along those lines, wanting to make sure that that is written. And we talked about this a little bit already, but avoiding, if possible, paying in cash and making large upfront deposits. What we're wanting to do and what we encourage folks to do is pay as work is completed. So again, avoiding any payments upfront is absolutely critical. Different ways that you can help to support older adult family members and those in your network with this big idea of avoiding contractor fraud and contractor fraud safety is one, sharing some of these top tips that we just shared out with you all. So there's going to be a little bit of repetition, but these are all really critical things to understand. Again, making sure that older adults that your neighbors, family members, those that are in your network, know to avoid any solicitations from contractors that make those door-to-door offers. Maybe helping to verify contractors. So going on a local contractor board or different consumer protection sites and offering help, offering time, and doing this together. This key action of helping older adults to remember, do not pay upfront. Please, as work gets completed, that is the most appropriate time to be paying for the work as it's getting done again. We said this a couple times already, but avoiding to paying in cash, and then also wanting to make sure that if this is something that older adults are wanting in your network, stay involved in the process and be an extra set of eyes on the situation so that way anything suspicious gets caught early on. So we were pretty quick with that section. We're more than happy to follow up with more resources. You can really deep dive and go into more contractor fraud information. But as we're wrapping up here, and again, we could stay on later and would love to get to some of your questions, we wanted to just offer a quick takeaway and some resources. So again, we talked about important documents. What are those documents that we want folks to organize and safeguard in advance of disasters and different ways to do it? We started to look at the importance of a recovery plan, of building that financial resilience for disasters and some main funding mechanisms that may be available post-disaster, including looking into insurance as the best tool for recovery. Again, we just looked at some top tips for avoiding contractor fraud, and we're going to take a look at a couple of resources as we wrap up. And again, we're being a little fast with this last section here, but we will be sharing these resources. And so you'll have all this information of different statewide agencies that have a lot of critical preparedness information at the individual and community level. And we really encourage you, as you continue on your preparedness journey, to take time navigating these different websites, learning what's available. And the second one here, the Washington Emergency Management Division, we will be having in our second session next week, a representative from that agency is going to do a fantastic session for us on different risks that the state faces. From there, wrapping up, just wanted to share again at SBP, we have a very robust resource hub with different preparedness and recovery resources and different types of tools that we encourage you to use. And then we have a survey that we would welcome feedback, and we can leave this up maybe as we transition over to questions. But if folks have any thoughts, we would absolutely love to hear your feedback, and we would really value learning from you all what you took away from this session here. So I will pass it over to Christina here to monitor any questions.
Thank you so much, guys. We have a lot of information. I know that we're at time, but if you guys can maybe stay on for about 5-10 minutes, I know that there's a few questions that we are seeing kind of a repeated theme that I wanted to get to. My first one is to Serena. Serena, when folks, we talked about residential facilities are required to have disaster plans. When people are researching like where, uh, you know, a place for their loved ones to live, what might be like the first two questions you would ask one of these facilities about their disaster preparation?
Well, thinking back to my granny, I think the questions I would ask is what supplies do they have for an emergency? And where are they moving people if they evacuate? So it could be multi-point where they're moving people. So, for example, there was a fire, a very large fire in a facility in Montesano. They had 77 residents that needed to be moved because there was a fire in the facility. The first stop for those residents was the high school gym. And from there, the residents were moved to facilities across Western Washington, from Blaine all the way down to Vancouver. So knowing where your family member is going is very important to know, so you know how to reconnect with them. That is also part of their plan. So asking that question in addition, how will you notify me where my loved one is?
Awesome. Thank you, Serena. And I'll open this to anyone. One thing is like there's being prepared, and we talked a little bit about preparing your kid or preparing for the event. But then like prescription drugs and things like that, they expire, right? So having some set aside is important. Would you recommend like how often should you kind of revisit your go kit to make sure that everything is still kind of applicable and relevant to the current situation?
For us, we do it twice a year. So we set it on daylight savings when it starts and when it ends. This is also a great time when you replace batteries in your smoke detector, your carbon monoxide um, alarm as well. And then make sure you're checking your kit, your documents, your plans. Make sure that maybe you added a new family member or a pet. What are their needs? Are they included in your plan? Is one of your pets not around anymore and you can remove that from your kit? Make sure your food and your water is not expired, or if you're doing rotations, that's a great time to do your rotations at that point. So that is when I do mine. Tessa, did you have more to add?
Yeah, and as we go through these questions here, I'll stop screen sharing so we could see folks respond. So hopefully you could see that okay. But I really, just to reiterate what you said, Serena, we recommend at least once a year. So your guidance of doing it twice is even better. But yeah, we definitely want to make sure this is something that folks are thinking about throughout the year. So I would say the one thing I want to add on is that no matter how many times you do it, at least once, hopefully twice a year, that we really want to encourage folks to understand that this is not something, we don't want this to become, top of mind right before a disaster strikes. So right when we get a warning that a different type of event is coming on, this is something that in blue skies, so when there is not a disaster on the horizon, that we want folks to be thinking about this. So for kits, for example, that way, if you notice that you have different items that you have to restock, then throughout the year, if different items go on sale, it's top of mind, so you can grab them and continue stocking your kit. And so you can really take advantage of things like that to spread out the cost of what can sometimes be, a costly endeavor.
Thanks, Tessa and Serena. There's quite a bit of questions. We recommended about having cash on hand if possible. And we did have some questions in here about like, shouldn't I be able to, access my bank? Wouldn't a credit card work? I'll start, and then if you guys want to jump in. I was in the Loma Prieta earthquake in '89, which happened really quick. We had no preparing, and so like going to the grocery store, like electricity was out. So while the stores may have made it available for us to like go in and get supplies, there was no way to run, a credit card or an ATM. Also, in your circumstances, if your power goes out, while your bank is still out there, you might not be able to access your bank from a computer or a phone. If you don't have electricity, or if you don't have like backup power that you can access. So these are, maybe just a couple of reasons to think about, maybe having some cash on hand that you can access. Someone had mentioned in small bills, which is really important. Not a lot of folks are going to be able to cash a, $100 bill when you go. And then I'm going to pass it off to see if Helen or Serena or Tessa has any follow-up on that.
Yeah, you covered it, but I would just say we're talking about those real catastrophes here, not a minor disaster event, but one where power could be out for weeks. So you take a recent example like Hurricane Helene, where it impacted Western North Carolina this past year, and many parts of the region were out of power for weeks, if not several months even. And there was just high reporting on how credit card use was really severely impacted. Most businesses couldn't process transactions. And so you really get into, during these severe events, a much more of that cash economy. And so while these are things that are less likely than, like smaller events that have a higher probability, it's again trying to avoid a lot of that hardship post event by putting aside whatever you're able to in emergency cash. And so something's better than nothing. That's just, it's the starting point. But the more you're able to do, and especially also putting it in small bills, will be helpful if it were ever needed.
Great. Thanks, Helen. We did have one person say if you could, and then I think this is probably the last question and we can sign off. We had someone ask if you could talk a little bit more about earthquake insurance being on the West Coast. My friends we live in the ring of fire. There's volcanoes and earthquakes all around us. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that also is something that isn't in your typical homeowner policy. So I don't know if there's anything in additional that you might be able to share about earthquake insurance.
Yeah. And so, the next webinar will talk a little bit more about learning your risks of the area you're in. And so that's really the starting point, is knowing first off if you're in an area with high risk for earthquake, in which case you'd want to try to consider getting some coverage. Most traditional policies, are going to be similar to how a homeowner's policy works. However, they typically have a higher deductible than a normal homeowner's policy, given that earthquakes, we're talking about, really large scale events. And so it might be that the deductible is between 10 and 25% of your coverage limit. And so again, something to think about if you're in a very high risk area, but knowing that it's also a very costly type of insurance, depending. I did see someone in the chat though, talking about for the area that they're in, it's not too bad. And so you don't want to assume, you want to go and find out if you're at high risk. But I would definitely say, again, just knowing it's excluded from a homeowner's policy or renter's policy. And so if you're at risk, you do need to purchase separately if you're able.
Thank you, Helen. And I know this has been a lot of information. I just want to assure folks that we will be sending up a follow-up email to everyone who registered, even the ones that registered and weren't able to jump on today, with a video recording of today's event. So you can go back and look at it again. We're going to also try and pull down a transcript. I know someone had asked if there might be a transcript, and then follow up with a whole plethora of resources and information. We will have that all in an email that we send to you. There is a question here I see from Pam. Is there a site that tells you the risks at your location? That's a perfect intro. Tune in next week when we will have Holly from Washington's Emergency Management Division, who is actually going to go over some of the common disasters in Washington State and how you can prepare for those. So a little plug. And I don't know if Bruce, if you go to, I'm going to type it in here. If you are not registered for next week's event, my mouth is not working right now. I am popping a link in the chat right now, aarp.org disaster prep WA. If you go there, there will be registration for next week's event, and I've already started loading some resource in there that we will add to that as well. So I want to thank all of our panelists and experts, Serena, Helen, and Tessa. Thank you for joining us today. And for all of you Washington folks, we know that you have many ways that you can spend your day. And I just want to say thank you so much for choosing to spend part of it with us. Thank you, and we hope to see you next week. Bye, everybody.